Welcome back to Chapter 2, and this is Part 2 of Life Among the Indians, and I will begin with as follows. But we must hasten over these events. Though now removed from us by the space of 3/4 of a century, they were fresh when the others, the writer, assisted to carry the tide of civilization into the region. In 1780, the Kentucky Rangers under Colonel Clark destroyed not only the cornfields of the Indians at Chillicothe, but also everything that related to subsistence on which they could lay their hands. Thus, for a time, the savages were compelled to relinquish their barbarous and treacherous assaults upon the settlers and devote themselves to the hunt in order to obtain subsistence for their people. But it was the grand rendezvous of the Shawnees, Wyandots, Wawas, Potawatomis, and various other tribes preparatory to their incursion into Kentucky in the summer of 1782, of which a more particular account will be given when we come to narrate the history of that monster, Simon Girty, who was one of the leading spirits in this savage council. That very fall, the whites took vengeance in the destruction of all the cabins at Chillicothe, though the Indians themselves escaped. In 1791, Old Chillicothe was the scene of a desperate battle between General Harmer and the Indians. He had entered the Indian country from the Fort Washington, now Cincinnati, at the head of 1,453 men. Colonel Hardin, with 600 Kentucky militia, formed a reconnoitering party in advance. The Indians everywhere fled as he approached, setting fire to their villages and destroying their goods with their own hands. To overtake them, he placed himself at the head of a scout of 210 men and pushed ahead with great rapidity. This scout was attacked by an inconsiderable party of Indians when the raw militia broke and fled, leaving the brave men who would not fly to their fate. 23 of the party fell, and only a small portion succeeded in rejoining the army. Yet General Harmer pushed on. He succeeded in reducing most of the Indian towns to ashes and destroying their provisions. When within 8 miles of Chillicothe on the Little Miami, he halted and late at night sent forward Colonel Hardin to attack the enemy. The action commenced early in the morning. The savages fought with desperation, and some of the American troops again acted as cowardice, but the officers bore themselves gallantly and utterly, regardless of personal safety, rushed forward into the thicket of the fight. It was a severe and disastrous conflict. More than 50 regulars and 100 militia, and a large portion of the officers, including the brave Fontaine, Willis, and Frothingham, were slain upon the battleground. The number of the enemy slain was not known, but it must have been great, as General Harmer was permitted to retire without molestation. Harmer, in his official report, claimed the victory, but it was doubtful which party lost most of the conflict. Major General Arthur St. Clair succeeded Harmer in command of the forces at the Northwest. There was now a loud and earnest appeal from the exposed settlers for protection, and this could be obtained only by the destruction of their savage foes. If this assertion seems too strong, let me give a fact and evidence. In 1790, a treaty was proposed to the savages at Miami. They asked 30 days for deliberation. It was granted, and before the 30 days had passed, more than 120 persons had been killed and captured, and several prisoners roasted alive. At the close of the specified time, the Indians utterly refused to make any answer to the proposition for the treaty. Nor is this all. Their prisoners were often roasted alive, and in the most revolting barbarities were practiced upon them. Then, too, many who surrendered under promise of having their lives spared were immediately butchered in cold blood. Can we wonder that those whom war had exposed to these barbarities, and whose friends had been victims of them, called aloud for vengeance? The whole land was in mourning. More than 2,000 of the settlers had, in some form, been murdered or killed in battle by the savages. Along with the wail of sorrow and the appeal for protection, the deep, muttered cry for vengeance was indeed heard. The destruction of the Indian towns and the establishment of the chain of military posts was the only thing that could give protection to the settlements. With these objects in view, General St. Clair in 1792 entered the Indian Territory at the head of over 2,000 men. On the 2nd of November, he encamped within 15 miles of the Miami villages. Soon after daylight, the savages commenced an attack upon the militia, which was thrown into confusion and fled in disorder. They burst through the lines of the regulars into the camp. The officers made great efforts to restore order, but with only partial success. The Indians pressed upon the heels of the flying militia, and engaged General Butler with great intrepidity. The action now became warm and general, and the fire of the assailants passing round both flanks of the first line in a few minutes was poured with equal fury upon the rear. The artillerists in the center were mowed down, and the fire was the more galling, as it was directed by an invisible enemy crouching on the ground or concealed behind trees. In this manner, they advanced toward the very mouth of the cannon, and fought with the infuriated fierceness with which success always animated savages. Some of the soldiers exhibited military fearlessness, and fought with great bravery. Others were timid and disposed to fly. With a self-devotion which the occasion required, the officers generally exposed themselves to the hottest of the contest, and fell in great numbers in desperate efforts to restore the battle. The commanding general, though he had sometime been enfeebled by severe disease, acted with personal bravery and delivered his orders with judgment and self-possession. A charge was made upon the savages with the bayonet, and they were driven from their covert with some loss, a distance of 400 yards, but as soon as the charge was suspended and the soldiers had withdrawn, the savages, with fresh vigor, returned to attack. General Butler was mortally wounded. The left wing was broken, and the artillerists were killed, almost to a man. The guns were secured, and the camp penetrated by the enemy. A desperate charge was headed by Colonel Butler, although he was severely wounded, and the Indians were again driven from the camp, and the artillery recovered. Several charges were repeated with partial success. The enemy only retreated to return to the charge, flushed with new ardor. The ranks of the troops were broken, and the men pressed together in crowds, and were shot down without resistance. A retreat was all that remained to save the remnant of the army. Colonel Drake was ordered to charge a body of the savages that intercepted the retreat. Major Clark, with his battalion, was ordered to cover the rear. These orders carried into effect, and a most disorderly flight commenced. A pursuit was kept up for 4 miles, when, fortunately, the natural greediness of the savage appetite for plunder called back the Indians to the camp to share in their spoils, throwing away their arms to expedite their flight. The disorderly troops continued their retreat till they reached Fort Washington. This was a most disastrous battle. 631 were left dead upon the field, of whom 38 were officers, and 263 were wounded. The savages were led on in this engagement by Miss SCIOTO chief, who had acquired experience in the arts of war under the British during the Revolution. So very superior was his knowledge of tactics that the Indian chiefs, though extremely jealous of him, yielded the entire command to him, and he arranged and fought the battle with great combination of military skill. Their force amounted to 4,000. They reported their killed were 65, but it must have been more. They took a vast amount of plunder, including 7 pieces of cannon, a large number of horses, and over 200 oxen. And the chief restrained the pursuit, saying that they had killed enough. Though the news of this battle spread gloom over the country, it stimulated rather than retarded action, and multitudes were eager for revenge. General Scott, at the head of 1,000 mounted Kentucky volunteers, marched against a party of the victors. He came upon them on the fatted field. They were still rioting in their plunders, riding upon the backs of the captured oxen, and acting as if the whole body were drunken. He instantly attacked them. Their defeat was complete. More than 200 of their members were left dead upon the fields. The cannon and most of the stores were retaken, and the party returned in triumph. The great battle before the termination of the early Indian War was fought under the direction of General Anthony Wayne, who had been appointed to the command upon the resignation of General St. Clair. He commanded the confidence of the Western people in a high degree, and was generally called on account of his reckless bravery. Mad Anthony is what he was called, but his appointment to the command of the Western Army was no mad act. Negotiations were at first earnestly attempted with the Indian tribes, but without any effect. The two excellent officers, Colonel Hardin and Major Truman, who had been sent to convey overtures to the Indians, were cruelly murdered by them. The horrors of the war were again to be realized. The first step of General Wayne was to enter the Indian country and to erect a fortification upon the old site of St. Clair's defeat. This he called Fort Recovery. His principal camp was called Greenville. He had under his command about 2,000 soldiers, and soon after he commenced his operations, he was joined by General Scott with 11 mounted militia from Kentucky. Though the Revolutionary War had closed and the two countries were at peace, yet the British government still retained many of their forts which were within the territory of the United States. At this juncture, while Wayne was progressing northward through the western part of Ohio, a detachment of British soldiers from Detroit occupied a fortified position on the Miami of the Lakes. They evidently designed to give encouragement and protection to the Indians, if not to aid them directly. But Wayne was too determined in purpose and too strong in force to be turned aside. On the 8th of August he reached the confluence of the Auglaize and the Miami of the Lakes. Here were the most extensive and richest settlements of the Western Indians, and it was only about 30 miles from the fort established by the British. The whole strength of the Indians was about 2,000, and they were encamped in the vicinity of that post. Still another attempt was made to prevent the fusion of blood. Suitable messengers were dispatched to have an interview with the savages. They were exhorted to forsake the evil counsels that were plunging them into ruin, and to accept the offers of peace and be restored to their homes, and delivered from the horrors of famine which was consuming them and their families. The reply was evasive, and sufficiently indicated that the Indians were not yet prepared to enter into a treaty. General Wayne now settled it in his mind that the battle must be fought. On August 20th, his army marched forward in columns. Major Price was in advance at the head of a reconnoitering scout. After advancing 5 miles, suddenly heavy fire from concealed savages was poured upon him. He immediately retired beyond the reach of their guns, and Wayne prepared for a general action. The Indians had chosen their position with great judgment. They had moved into a thick wood in advance of the British post, and had taken position among some fallen timber which had been blown down by a tornado. Here they were formed in 3 lines according to the Indian custom, and were inaccessible to the horse. The American Legion was ordered to advance in front with trailed arms, and first rouse the enemy from his covert, and then pour upon him their fire. The cavalry, commanded by Captain Campbell, was to advance between the Indians and the river, where the wood permitted them to penetrate, and charge their left flank. General Scott, at the head of his mounted volunteers, was commanded to make a circuit so as to turn their right. This program of the action was promptly carried out by the gallant officers in command, and with brilliant success. But such was the impetuosity of the charge made by the first line of the infantry, that the enemy were completely broken and dislodged from their position. The brave men who had dislodged them did their work so suddenly, and then followed up the pursuit with such rapidity, that the few seconds of the second line or of the mounted volunteers had the opportunity to take any part in the action. The savages were pursued to the very gates of the British fort. It appears that the British commandant, had promised the Indians that if defeated he would open to them the gates of the fort and give them protection. Accordingly, when routed, they huddled like frightened sheep before the gates, and here pressed in the rear by the infantry, and on the other side by the horses, they were cut down in great numbers, almost without resistance. The slaughter of the Indians was immense. This battle was fought on the 20th of August, 1794. The American loss in killed and wounded was 107, but among these were some of the bravest officers upon the field, such as Captain Campbell and Lieutenant Towles. The rout of the Indians was complete. Their force was broken and scattered. General Wayne remained 3 days on the field of battle, reducing the houses and cornfields above and below the fort, and some of them within pistol shot of it to ashes. The houses and stores of Colonel McKee, an English trader, whose great influence among the savages had been uniformly exerted for the continuance of the war, were burned among the rest. Correspondence on these 2 points took place between General Wayne and the commander of the fort. The latter, however, soon came to understand that he could avoid hostilities with Wayne only by being careful not to interfere with his operations. Having completed the work of destruction here, General Wayne returned to Agulhas and destroyed all the Indian towns and corn within 50 miles of the river. The savages were thus made to understand that peace or entire destruction were the only alternatives, yet they continued to commit straggling depredations till the next summer. And then on the 3rd of August, as we have already noticed, a definite treaty of peace was established. Thus terminated the long protracted struggle between civilization and barbarism. The number of individuals wantonly murdered by the savages, independently of those slain in battle, can be numbered only by thousands. Yet strange as it may appear, the tide of immigration was scarcely checked by these outrages, and the civilized population of the Great Valley was constantly on the increase. And that is the end of Chapter 2. Within the next few days, we'll begin Chapter 3, which is titled Indian Cruelties. Thanks for stopping by, watching. Have a God bless. God bless, and have a great evening is what I meant. Take care.